There's 5 main topics that we're going to be covering today. We're going to start quite simple by looking at an example of a very easily customizable button object that you can use to call whatever functions you want in GameMaker. Next, we're going to have a look at GameMaker's 9-slice system, which will allow us to scale our UI sprites to whatever size we want without them looking all stretched and ugly. Then we're going to figure out how to draw objects to the GUI layer so they'll always stay on screen even if we have like a moving camera in the game. After that, we're going to have a look at what sequences are and how we can use those to lay out our UI elements in a way that's simple to implement and will also work with different resolutions. And then last but not least, we'll make our UI look a bit more fancy by animating it. I will be using GML code in my project, but the scripting parts will not be super advanced. So even if you're not too familiar with GML code yet, I think you will be able to understand what I'm doing. Also, there will be a short Q&A session at the end. So if you end up with any questions, feel free to ask them then, and I will do my best to answer. So I'm going to go ahead and just show you what the project is looking like that we're going to make today. It starts quite simple with these buttons that you can hover over. They change color, and you can click them to start the game, which is not much of a game. It's just a car that we can steer around with these two UI buttons down here. And then we have a pause button up here that if we click it, we get this fancy pause menu that slides into the game quite nicely. And if we resume it, it disappears quite smoothly as well. So that's pretty much what we're going to try to do today. I'm going to close this and go back to a bit of an earlier version of this project where the UI stuff is not in yet. If I run it right now, you'll see it's just the car driving. There's no buttons anywhere. We can't interact with it at all. So that's what we're going to do now. So to start, I'm just going to show you the button object that's already in here. It's pretty simple and versatile as well. So it just has a simple sprite, a single image sprite that is looking like that. That's pretty much all we need for our button. And then we have a bunch of variables defined in here. The first one is the most important one. This one is called onClick, and it's basically the function that we want to execute whenever we click on our button. The next one is the text that we want to display on the button. Third one is if we don't want to display a text and instead just have it be an icon, we can put that in here. And then lastly, we have 3 colors in here. The first one is whichever color the button is supposed to be. If we're not interacting with it, then we have like a highlight color when we hover over it. And the third one is the color that it's supposed to have when we click it. We also have 3 events in here, which are pretty straightforward as well. In the draw event, the button just draws itself. Then if it has an icon sprite assigned, it will draw that sprite on top of it. And then lastly, it will draw whatever text is assigned to it. In the step event is where we change the color of the button. First up, we have like a collision detection here, trying to figure out whether or not we are currently hovering over the button with our mouse, and we do that with this collision point, checking at the mouse position to see if we're hovering over this button. And if we do, we gradually change the color of the button towards our hover color. We do that by using merge color, which is basically a lerp function for colors. So what this does is instead of immediately changing our color to the new one, we just change it towards our hover color by 10% each frame so that it doesn't immediately change but gets this smooth transition. And if we're not hovering, we are changing the color back to our default color. And then the third event is just a left pressed event in which we tell our button if it has a function assigned in this onClick variable, we want to execute that function. And this can be any function, either that is GameMaker, that is from inside GameMaker, or a function that you define in any of your scripts. So we'll see how that works exactly later. And then also, when we click the button, we want to change our color to be the click color. So let's just go ahead and use this one button object to already create these two buttons in here, the start button and the end game button. I'm just going to go ahead and drag one of them in here, scale them a little bit. And then since we defined the variables of this object in the variable definitions, we can now go into the room editor, double click our object and click on this variables button here. And this will allow us to override the standard variables that we've defined for it. So for example, if we want to create the start game button here, we can just go ahead and override this onClick variable. In our case, to start the game, we want to just move on to the next room. So we can just define room go to next, which is a GameMaker function, as our onClick function. And so when we click on it in the game, it will actually call that function and go to the next room. Let's also edit the text here and call that start game. And then let's also change our hover color to make it a bit of a light green, so it looks a little more inviting. And then to get our endgame button, we can just use that same object, put it in here, scale it up a little bit, and change the variables here. So for this one, we'll just use game end, which is also a GameMaker function. We'll give it the text and game, and we will change our hover color to be a little bit of a red tone, just like that. So let's just see if this works right now. Oh, we actually have to change the room order, so we start in the menu and not in the game. Let's try that again. Okay, the scaling is a little too small right now, but you can see that we have the different colors here. We have the text on it. If we click this one, it ends the game. If we click the other one, it starts the game. Let's actually make these a little bigger so the text doesn't go over them. And so one more thing that you will notice on this is that since we scaled the buttons up quite a lot, they look a little ugly now. That's because our button sprite is just a rectangular sprite, and we've just scaled it to be quite stretched out. And unless we do something about that, it will always look a little ugly. So what we can do to circumvent that is use 9-slice, which is a feature in GameMaker that allows us to scale our UI sprites however we want without them starting to look all stretched and ugly like that. And how it works is that it basically splits our sprite into 9 different parts, and then it only scales certain parts in certain ways, while leaving the corner parts, for example, which we always want to look round and smooth, at their original resolution. So let's just go ahead and open up this button sprite right here. And you will find a 9-slice option over here that you can open up. And if you then press activate 9-slice here, it will activate that feature for you. And it will also give you these pink lines in the sprite here that you can move around. And these are basically there to tell GameMaker where it should slice the sprite into its different parts. And we're just gonna go ahead and put these in a way that it isolates these corner parts that we don't want to get scaled around from the edge parts and from the center as well. And even just with this setup, you can go over here on the right side where you have a bit of a preview of how a sprite will look if you now scale it around. And you will notice we don't have that ugly stretching anymore. Even though we scale the sprite around, the edges, the corners will always stay with that nice and smooth round corner there, which is pretty nice for our purposes. One more thing that you can um, do here, which we don't need for this case, but if you happen to have like some sort of pattern on your sprite, like for example, let's actually open this one up and just draw some random dots in here. You will see that these, since they are in the center, they will still get stretched by default, but you can also tell it to actually use a different tile mode. For example, instead of stretching, you can tell it to repeat this pattern that it has in there. You can also tell it to like mirror repeat it, that it will look like this. And you have some other option as well, like just having it in there once or even not having it in there at all. But for our purposes, because we don't actually have anything in there, we'll just stick with the stretch, and we will also remove these again because they don't actually look that great. But if we actually now go back into our menu room, you will notice that already even in the room editor, these look different. And if we start our game, we will also see that they now don't look as stretched out and ugly anymore. So basically, whenever you use this sprite in the game now, be that by attaching it to an object or by drawing it via code in a scaled way, it will always use this 9-slice method of scaling instead of the traditional one. Now, next up, we're going to try to add our buttons into the game, which is a bit of a more difficult task than just adding them to a menu, because in the game we actually have a moving camera. Now, if we just go ahead and put our object button in here, like if we want to make that pause button that you remember from the start, we just want it to be here on the screen, and then we press play. You can already imagine what's going to happen. It's just going to stay here on the screen, and as soon as the camera moves out, we can't actually click on it anymore, and that's not of much use for us. So what we can do to actually keep our buttons on screen is to draw them to the GUI layer instead of the actual room itself. The GUI is basically an additional layer that GameMaker draws on top of the main game, and that is independent from any game cameras or zooms and camera rotations that you might have in the game. So it's the perfect way to keep our UI on screen at all times. And to do that, we can quite easily just add a new event in here, which is called draw GUI. We'll add that in here, and we'll just take the stuff that we now have in the draw event. We'll just cut that out here and instead put it into the draw GUI event. And this will actually just tell the object to no longer draw onto like room coordinates, but instead onto coordinates on the GUI layer, which is like basically the equivalent of the display coordinates. You still have to like keep the draw event and keep it empty so it doesn't additionally also draw to the room. So we'll just keep this one empty, maybe do this in here so it's doesn't draw into the room anymore. But even with this change, just moving this one to the draw GUI, we will see that the button is now on this position and it doesn't leave the screen anymore. We do also notice though that we can't hover over it anymore, and like it doesn't change the color to the white that it usually should. And that is because we will have to be doing a little bit of an adjustment to our collision detection here, because with this detection here, we are currently checking for the mouse position in the room and not on the GUI layer, which is not useful anymore because we want to use the GUI layer and not the room positions. So let's just go ahead and instead of mouse X and mouse Y, use something called device mouse X to GUI and device mouse Y to GUI. And this basically gives us, instead of the room position of the mouse, it gives us the position of the mouse on the GUI layer, which is exactly what we need to figure out if we are currently touching the button with our mouse or not. Let's see if that works by just pressing play. As you can see, now the hover works again. What doesn't work is clicking yet, because we will also have to change this left pressed event, because this one just as well is dependent on room position. So instead, let's change this event to a global left pressed event, which gets called not only if we click like on the object in the room, but which gets called whenever we click the mouse at all. And then we will also add an if here just to check whether we're currently hovering or not. And since we already have that in this mouse hover variable, we can just check for that one to see if we are currently clicking on the button or not. So with these few changes, you will see that we can now click on this button and interact with it in the similar way we could before, but it is now on the GUI. So let's just actually go ahead and make this into a functional button really quick, because this is supposed to be our pause button. So we're going to go back into the room editor and change the variables here. For pausing, we actually already have some functions in here that I put in there previously, and basically they just stop the car and the resume starts the car again. But we can just use these functions that we've defined in a script in our button as well. So let's go ahead and do that. Just put game pause in here, and let's give it the pause icon as well. So now if we start it, we can pause the game and it will actually stop the car. We can't resume it. We'll do that later, but at least this functionality works for now. So next up, we're going to try to add the little control buttons that we had, like on the bottom left, that allows us to control our car and change the direction. And we could do that, but just by just adding more buttons into the room directly. However, there are a bit of possible problems with that, because, for example, if you have a lot of different rooms and you want to add your UI to all of them, you'll have to go in there and just add all of the buttons into every room. And then maybe if you at some point decide that your layout should be different, you're going to have to go back into every room and make changes to the UI everywhere. So it can be a bit tedious. That's why we're going to look at a different method of doing that, which is by using sequences. And what a sequence is basically a collection of a bunch of assets, like objects, sprites, or even sounds you can put in there that you can arrange within a sequence without having to put them in any specific room. So instead of adding all of our buttons to each of our room, we can just create a sequence, put in our UI there, arrange it however we want, and then if we need it in the game, we can just spawn the sequence and it will spawn all of our buttons at the correct positions however we need them. So let's just go ahead and create one of these sequences here. I'm going to call it sequence controls. And as you will notice, there are like 3 parts here. This upper part is pretty similar to how the room editor works. You can just drag in different objects. You can also drag in sprites and stuff like that if you want to. And you can uh, put them in here, move them around, adjust size, and stuff like that. Um, and this is, however, independent from any room. So you'll see the room dimensions actually here by this little outline. So you can see where on the screen things would be if we were to like put them somewhere. And that's how that works. However, one thing that is a bit of a downside to sequences as opposed to adding stuff into a room is that we can't double click and edit the variables the same way we could in a room. So I can't go in here and just tell this button to use a different function as the click function because I don't have the power to edit that in a sequence the same way I have in a room. So to do that here, we'll actually have to create different objects for every button that we need, which sounds like work, but it's not actually that horrible because we can just create objects that are child objects of our original object button, and then they will just use the same functions and stuff like that. So let's just create a object button arrow left, steer to the left. Let's give it the button sprite, and then let's assign our original button as a parent, which will copy all of the events in there, and it will also allow us to have the same variables in here that we can now edit in here. So our object button arrow left is supposed to steer our car. So let's go into the car and see we already have some functions in here that we can use. The drive left function is the one we're gonna need. So let's go back in here and just put object car dot drive left. So it will actually, when we click on it, access this different object and call a function within it, which is pretty neat. We're also going to add the proper icon on here, the left arrow. And that's pretty much all we need for that button. Let's just create the right button by duplicating this one and changing the name, and also changing these ones to be right instead of left. So just like that, we have these two new buttons that we can now actually use within a sequence. Let's just remove this one again and instead put this one in here and then put the right one in here. Let's align them properly. And now one thing you will notice is if you add anything into a sequence, it will always open up a new track down here. And that is because sequences are also used for animation, which we will get to later. But for now, we will actually have to make sure that our objects actually stay within the sequence for the whole duration. Like as you can see here, there's a little bit of a timeline, and that by default is going to take like 1 second. But our buttons currently only exist for the 2 first frames of it. So let's just go ahead and drag these out so they actually stay in our sequence. So now that we have that, we will have to figure out how to get this sequence into our game. I'm just going to create a new object for that. I'm going to call it object UI, and I'm going to pretty easily just create this sequence by calling the function layer sequence create, and this one will allow us to basically spawn the sequence into our game. So first up, we're going to have to supply a layer. I'm going to put UI in here, which is an instance layer in our game. You can also use instances like the standard instances layer if you want to, but it's always nice to have things a little in order there. So we are putting it on a different layer. Then we'll have to tell it on which position we want to spawn our sequence. And as you will see, if you open up the sequence as well, it actually has an origin in a similar way a sprite has, and that per default is going to be in the middle. So for now, let's go ahead and spawn it in the middle of our GUI, which we can do by using a function called display get GUI width. Let's take half of that to get to the middle, and then let's use display get GUI height and take half of that to get to the middle of the vertical layer. And then we're going to tell it which sequence we want to spawn, which is sequence controls. And that is pretty much all we need to actually spawn this one. Let's just go ahead and, oh no, actually, let's go ahead first and actually add this object UI into our game, because otherwise we won't see the sequence in there. So now if we press start, you'll see our sequence is in here, our buttons are in here, we can actually control our car, make it go left and right, and everything like that. That's pretty neat. One more thing that using this approach with sequences is good for, though, is that we can actually use it to keep our UI on the right parts of the screen, even if we change the resolutions of the game. So basically, like, for example, if we wanted to decide at some point that our game would look better in a smaller window, let's just go ahead and try that out right here. If we were to say, maybe we should run it in a 720 by 480 window as well, instead, like this, what you will notice if we now start the game is, since we changed the screen size, our buttons are no longer on the screen, because our sequence size is still the same that we had before. So our buttons are like somewhere over here. We can't actually click them anymore. But we can easily fix that by just moving around the origin of our sequence. So if we just grab this one and put it into the corner where we want our buttons to stick to, and then instead of spawning our sequence in the middle of our GUI, spawn it in that corner as well, you will see that we don't have that problem anymore. So now we're not going to spawn it here, but instead on x equals 0 and on the full height of our GUI to get to the corner there. And now you'll see that even though our sequence still has the same dimensions as before, it will stay in the proper position here. And if we go back and like make this one big again, it will actually be at the proper position there as well. Let's go ahead and see if it works on the big screen again. There it is. So no matter how we scale our screen now, it will always be in the right positions here. It won't get cut off anymore, which is pretty neat. Now, next up, we're going to actually add our grand finale, which is the pause menu that we're going to animate. To do that, let's start by creating two more um, button objects. Let's just duplicate this one. And this one is going to be our resume button. We're going to use our resume function that we have here as the onClick game resume. And then we don't want it to have an icon, but have text instead. We're just going to just say resume. And then we're going to make one more, which is going to be our exit button. And this one is just going to end the game again. Game end. We could also go back to the previous room by using like room go to previous. However, we're just going to use this one for now. And we're going to give it the text exit. And we're going to add a new sequence for this because this one is actually going to have different content. And we're going to call this one sequence pause menu. Wait, that's not actually, that's an object. Let's not do that. Let's instead create a sequence pause menu. And in this one, let's once again add our buttons in here, the resume button, the exit button. Let's scale them a bit and let's put them in the position where we want them to. Now, what we want to achieve is for our buttons to actually start outside the screen, and then once we pause the game, they're supposed to like slide in there smoothly and have this animation that gets them in there. And how we do that in a sequence is as follows. First of all, let's once again, no, very first of all, let's change the duration of this one because right now the sequence length is 60 frames, which is a whole second, which would be a little long for our buttons to take to get in here. So let's make it 30 instead. And then let's actually drag these ones out again so they stay in the sequence for the whole duration. And now to get movement into our animation, what we do is move around this playhead to a certain position and then decide where we want our buttons to be at this position in the sequence. So at the very beginning of our sequence, we actually want our buttons to be outside of the screen, like down here. And then if we move our playhead to the end of the screen, at the end to the end of the sequence, we can put it there and move our buttons up here, and it will automatically record that we want a movement between the two. So if we move these around, you will see they will just slide in there like that. However, so far, this looks a little stiff. Since it's just a linear movement from A to B, it doesn't look very smooth yet, but we can change that quite easily by using something called curves, which we can access if we toggle curve mode right here and then open up one of the objects over in our track panel here. And this will show us all of the properties that we can change in the object. We are looking at the position right now, so we click on that. And then we can convert this movement to a curve. And this will show us the movement of both the x-axis and the y-axis. We don't have any movement on the x-axis, so we can just hide that one. And this is our movement on the y-axis right now, which is just pretty basic, straight line. But we can change that by opening up the animation curve library right here. It's a little small button right here. And under Bezier, we can actually find some cool alternative movements between 2 points. Uh, there's a bunch of different ones you can see here, like having a funny bounce right like that, or just having them smooth in all sorts of different ways. I really like the back one right here because it overshoots a little bit, but then goes back. And if you press that, it will automatically, you will see the curve down here change automatically like this. And if we now actually press play again, you will see that the movement is a lot smoother and doesn't look as janky anymore. So let's just add the same movement to our second button by converting it to a curve and then adding this back movement right here like that. So if we now press play, both of our buttons move in quite smoothly like this. So let's now go ahead and actually get this sequence into our game as well. Once again, we go into our UI object and we're just gonna copy this line to create our second sequence. This one actually, let's before deciding on the position here, let's see where we want our sequence to be anchored. And since our buttons are like kind of low on the screen, we should probably anchor it to the middle bottom here, like that. And then we will go ahead and spawn it in the lower middle of the screen as well. So display get GUI width by 2 to get to the center, and once again display get GUI height in total to get to the bottom. Now if we if we press play now, you will see that, oh wait, okay, that's the wrong sequence. Let's actually change this to be the pause menu. If we press play now, you will see that the buttons will just start sliding in there, which is not what we want. We only want them to start going in there once we pause the game. So to do that, we will actually have to pause the sequence when we spawn it, so it doesn't just start playing by itself. Because usually if you spawn a sequence, it will automatically start playing. To do that, we will use layer sequence pause, and to tell it which sequence to pause, we will actually have to get a sequence reference to the sequence, which we can do by just saving it in a variable. So we'll just say sequence pause equals to this sequence that we're creating right here. And then we can tell it to pause this specific sequence. Now if we play it, the sequence will still be there, but the buttons are just off screen because it hasn't started playing. Because we only want to start playing them in our pause function actually. So let's go ahead and go in there and just add some lines in here to actually play our sequence. And we can do that once again by using layer sequence A. We're going to have to tell it which sequence to play, and that's going to be object UI dot sequence pause. And this will open up our pause menu. There we go. It just stays on screen. But now we actually want the buttons to disappear again once we press resume. And to do that, we're going to have to start playing our sequence backwards. So to do that, we can tell our sequence to change the direction in which the playhead is moving. The playhead, as you might remember, as this thing right here. And by default, it's always going to move to the right until the end. But if we tell it to move to the left instead, it will basically play our animation backwards, which is what we're going to do now. So we're going to go ahead and use layer sequence head direction. And once again, we're going to say this is going to be the sequence of object UI called sequence pause. And then we're going to tell it to go to the left. We have these special variables for that, sec_dir left. And then we can play the sequence here again, only this time it's going to play backwards. Actually, we're going to also use this line up here to change the direction of the playhead back to right whenever we pause the game, because otherwise we could only pause and resume it once, and after that it would always try to move to the left whenever we play it, which is not what we want. So with these two changes, we should already be able to pause the game, resume it again, and do all of these things pretty smoothly like that. So that's pretty much what we've been wanting to see today. If you have any questions about what you saw here or any other GameMaker questions, we're going to go to the QA section right now, and you can ask whatever you want to know. Can I show the object GUI create function? Yes, I can. Let's go. I'm going to have to wait. If I disable it now, is that going to be a problem? Let's go to screen sharing here. And let's open the object UI. This is the create event in there. We just use layer sequence create to create the sequences. And then here we pause our sequence. Oh, I should have pushed this one. Okay, that's the question I was replying to. Can you go back to the variable list inspector thing? Is there any reason why you did things this way? Yes, I can go back to that. So basically, adding our variables to the object like this, instead of, for example, just adding a create event and putting like variables in here, like one used to do before these variables were a thing in GameMaker, is that I can actually like define them here. And then, as we did before, I can go into the room editor and just override some of the variables here. So as you can see, like in our button object, most of these variables are just undefined. Like the function here is undefined per default. The text is just empty, and the icon is also not there. But we can only put these in once we put them in the game, and then we can actually like edit them however we want. Because if we were to just define them in the object, like in the create event, we wouldn't be able to change them if we have different buttons that are supposed to do different things. So let's go to the next one. Do sequence, okay, wait, let's actually, and sharing again, go back to the Q&A mode. Do sequences apply to just the GUI, or will they spawn on the draw event too? They will spawn in any event. Like our buttons are only on the GUI because we added our buttons specifically to the GUI. But you can also use sequences to spawn whatever you want within the game. You can use them to make like cutscenes and stuff like that. You can also, for example, if you were to have like, I don't know, monster formations that you want to spawn in a certain like pattern every time, you could use sequences for that. You can use them to pretty much create anything within your game. You can also add different things, like not only objects, you can also add sprites and sounds in there as well. So they are pretty versatile. Okay. Are there any issues that may arise by setting the sequence origin to the top left corner and using layer sequence create 0, 0 instead of doing the GUI half math? It's not a problem as long as you don't change the resolution of your screen or your game window. So if you know that your window is always going to be working in the same uh, resolution, then it's fine to just use your sequence with an origin of 0, 0. But uh, as I mentioned before, if we change the resolution this way, we can make sure that it will always be on the correct position of the screen. Let's go here. How does display get GUI width work? It basically gets the width of your GUI, which per default, if you don't change anything about it, the GUI size is always the size of your window. But if you, for example, decide that, I don't know, maybe you're working like on a pixel art style game, and you want your GUI to be a little less high resolution, you can actually change um, the resolution of your GUI in GameMaker, and then it will always like give you that specific size uh, to work with that. Can you show how you added the sequence to the GUI layer versus game layer? There is no difference there. The only difference is that we um, decided to uh, add the buttons to draw the buttons to the GUI layer. So the difference is not in the sequence itself. If we spawn something with a sequence, it just gets spawned into the room. But our buttons have, if you remember, we changed the draw event to the draw GUI event, and that's why they appear on the GUI and not in the game itself. Okay, we're kind of uh, running out of time here. So let's see. Um, then you have some kind of additional sequence making the buttons go slightly up and down while paused. How would you have a secondary sequence in addition to the main one? Or like, well, yeah, we right now we have two different sequences. One was um, with the two control buttons with the that control the car, and then we had an additional sequence with the pause menu on it that we could play and pause. So yeah, you can have as many sequences in your game as you want, basically. Um, but if you want to animate different things independently from each other, you should always put them on different sequences so you can tell uh, some buttons to go somewhere and other buttons to stay where they are right now. This one, what would you do if you wanted to change the resolution? Your example would only work if you put elements in the bottom left corner. What if you wanted to put elements in all corners and then change the resolution? Pretty much what you would do then is to split your UI into different parts and decide which parts you want to stick to which corners. So if you have some buttons in the bottom left corner, you would make a sequence for those. If you have buttons in the bottom right corners, you would put them on a different sequence, and then you would um, put the origins of those into the respective corners and spawn them in the respective corners of the GUI as well. And then they would still all be visible if you change the resolution. All right, we're going to call it here. I hope some of you learned something from here. Stay tuned for further coaching webinars and other content. There's also going to be a recording of this on the YouTube channel later. Um, I'll also add a link to the project so you can look at all of those things are implemented in there later. All right, thanks everyone for watching and happy game making.